Andrey, welcome to Thiruvananthapuram.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone.
Andrey is a very, very major writer in Ukraine, somebody who honestly we need to know more about here in India and particularly in Kerala where we have such a literate culture. So I'm just very, very pleased that you're here. Now, what they wanted us to talk about is why we read. So I think you should go first and tell us what you read and why.
I think I'll start from the very beginning, and my very beginning actually lays in the Soviet era, which was partially era of darkness, partially era of hope, because it was 1960s, it was the beginning of the Khrushchev's time, and the time when the first anti-Stalin books were published, like Solzhenitsyn's Archipelago, not Archipelago, but One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. But I think first I started reading in order to check that the life is adventurous enough and worth living.
And you decided it was or it wasn't?
Yes, because actually, to tell you the truth, actually, my first books that I read, and I was given them in the school, mandatory every week, they were stories about Lenin for children. And they were not adventurous. But then the next reading stuff was 14 volumes of Jack London. And this was something much different.
That was interesting. So that was translated into Russian? Or?
Yeah. Because, I mean, Jack London was dead for a long time.
Yeah,
he,
so
he couldn't be anti-communist.
There was no communism to be anti at that time.
Yes.
And there were adventure stories and explorations of 19th century maritime adventures, if I remember right.
There was a lot of actually adventure literature, like Jules Verne, the French literature.
Yes, Around the World in 80 Days.
Yes, and the Soviet literature was trying to compete with them. So there were Soviet adventures and Soviet explorers and seafarers and treasure hunters. So, I mean, some of these books are still, alive.
Well, there's no reason why they shouldn't be. But there were many things that were not available and not permitted to be read, right?
Yes, and that's why I started reading in foreign languages. And in order to read these books, first I learned Polish language because we have censorship, of course, in the Soviet Union. And at the same time, in every big city, there was a bookshop which was called Druzhba, friendship. And there you could buy books from all socialist countries and some semi-socialist countries. And the most close language to Ukrainian and Russian among the socialist countries was Polish language. And Poland had less censorship. And they were translating books and novels from French, English, from American writers, which were not translated into Russian. So lots of people in Ukraine studied very easily and quickly Polish and were buying books in Polish and were reading in Polish.
That's fascinating. And was it a big challenge for you to learn Polish, or did you find that
it
you
was
had talent for languages? So you developed that talent?
I think if you live in multilingual society, you get this talent at once.
Great. So you read who in Polish?
I think Joseph Conrad. I read Latin American literature first, actually.
They had Garcia Marquez and so on.
Yeah, but they were very quickly also translated into Russian and Ukrainian, yes.
Okay, that sounds good. And so what were you looking to read in those days? Were you looking to read things that were not available to you in your mother tongue? Or was that
I think there was some kind of well-grounded arrogance towards the literature which was officially published. Everybody thought that if something is not published officially, it should be much better than the things I can buy. And of course, I mean, there were books which were published in Russian also, but very difficult to obtain. And you had to go through connections or pay bribes or exchange, because this was already the time of so-called deficit, when you didn't have enough meat in the shop of meat. And there was a wonderful joke about this. It is not about books, but it is about meat and fish. And actually, I think books in the Soviet time were as important as meat and fish.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and the joke goes like this. So the man comes to a meat shop and asks, sorry, of course there is nothing in the shop, no meat. And he says, don't you have any fish? And the lady says, well, they don't have any fish in the fish shop. We don't have any meat. We are a meat shop. So there were times when there were almost no good books in the bookshops.
Right, exactly.
And if you had actually a choice to buy a good book, you were forced to buy two bad books at once. So the good books were not sold alone.
Interesting. And then as you grew older, the situation became a little more liberal, as it were.
It was less liberal from the beginning of 70s, and at this time was the best for samizdat, for illegal publications.
Photocopied books. And
Yeah, photocopies, but I mean not photocopies like Xeroxes, but every page was photographed and printed on the hard photo paper. And you had a book which weighed 2 kilos. It's like 200 photos, and you had to turn photos, not pages, to read it.
Well, I guess we're lucky in the kind of communism we have here. They don't have not yet imposed that on us. You know, you've come to a communist ruled state. You're
I
aware.
know. Yes.
Must give you some slightly.
No. I feel very happy because I all the time reminded of my childhood.
No. We have all books possible here.
Yeah.
And fortunately, the communists of India have not learned the wrong lessons from their friends elsewhere. I mean, they've learned some wrong lessons too, but by and large, they have not been able to tamper with the basic democratic freedoms that we're living with.
I think it is all because of the climate. I mean, if you are a communist under the sun all the time, you become enlightened anyway.
Oh, the
And
light will dispel
more-
the darkness. Well, dispelling the darkness is all this morning seems to be about. But let's come back to you.
Can I ask you a question? What
Okay.
was your first book that you remember that you read in your childhood?
They were British, I'm sorry to say, books. The Noddy books by Enid Blyton.
Yeah.
My mother used to read them aloud to me. I was all of, I don't know, 1 or 2 years old. I actually began reading myself at about 2.5 because she jokes that she read so badly that I would have to grab the books from her and want to read them myself. And so I learned to read very quickly. And Enid Blyton was this amazing English writer who must have produced about 650 books in her lifetime in every conceivable genre. So she had books for tiny, tiny children, the Noddy books, which was the adventures of a doll in Toyland. Then you had books for slightly older children called The Five Find Outers and The Secret Seven. Then you went to slightly older children, The Famous Five. Then you went slightly above that to the adventure series, The Castle of Adventure, The Ship of Adventure, this kind of thing. And all of these involved slightly older childhood characters. So you grew up in your childhood reading age-appropriate Enid Blyton books. And because I enjoyed language and I enjoyed humor, I also read 2 other British writers who wrote children's books. One was a woman called Richmal Crompton, who created a character called William. He was a very naughty boy, constantly getting up to scripts, and wrote with delightful humor. And she again produced a lot of books, lots of stories. I read those. In fact, I have sitting in the audience a children's writer who has been writing the Indian answer to William.
Butterfingers.
Has been writing Butterfingers.
Are we
There
talking
you
about
are.
Butterfingers?
And
Yeah.
I'm proud to say I've launched every single one of the Butterfingers books. There are now 6 so far, and I've launched them all. So you can see the William obsession continues. Then there was also Billy Bunter, who was a British public school boy, again, churned out by somebody who was so prolific. People assumed that he must be a pseudonym for about 10 writers, because there were like 2 new Billy Bunter books every year. His name was Frank Richards. He actually was a real human being. And he produced about 150 books of the Billy Bunter series. A fat boy in a public school, boarding school, getting up to all sorts of trouble. And then as a male, it was impossible to escape some wartime adventure type thing. So I read the Biggles books of Captain W.E. John. Biggles was a flying ace who began in the First World War, and whose career extended all the way up to the Cold War because he stayed young, of course. But he was flying different kinds of aircraft, from a Sopwith Camel in the early books to flying jets in the final. But anyway, he was a World War pilot and very exciting. And one of my first stories to be published was an Indianized imitation of Biggles. I created an Anglo-Indian fighter pilot called Bellows, Reginald Bellows, Operation Bellows, and that was serialized in a magazine from starting just before my 11th birthday. So then writing and reading became more together. Even as a child, when I first started writing, I started scribbling when I was 6 years old. I was an asthmatic child. I frankly couldn't go out and play as much as I wanted to because I was I was struggling for breath with my asthma. There was no TV in India. There were no, obviously, Nintendo and computers and mobile phones weren't even a glint in anybody's eyes. And so I actually read everything I could lay my hands on, but I was the eldest child in the family, so I had no elder brothers or sisters to borrow books from. I read my parents' books quite precociously without fully understanding most of them. And then in my time I wrote. So when I wrote things very derivative of what I was reading. So instead of 5 English children running around solving mysteries and the 5 find-outers or the famous 5, I had 6 solvers who were Indian school children going off to my ancestral village in Kerala and solving mysteries there. So that's how I started writing. Unfortunately, those stories have now been lost forever, though my parents lovingly preserved them for decades. And I ended up moving on from this. As my reading matured, my writing also grew with it.
So, I mean, was there one book which changed your life when you became adolescent?
No, in adolescence I read indiscriminately. So I was reading Russian classics in translation in English. I was reading, obviously, British classics, because those are all available, American ones as well. So I was very much up on the 18th, 19th century writings of those languages.
Why did you read indiscriminately? Because you wanted to find out as much as possible about the world around you?
That's it. So why does one read? In my case, the illness also contributed, because I read for escape. If you can't breathe, the last thing you want to do is think about trying to breathe. So you need a mental distraction. I read for an escape. So I was sitting up there, very often unable to sleep even at night, and books were giving me that escape from my breathing problems. And so I read whatever I could find, and because whatever I could find varied enormously, it had to be eclectic. So I read every genre without exception, from science fiction to softcore pornography. Whatever I could find, I read it. And that gave me actually a very, very discerning taste. You have to read bad to appreciate good. You have to read different kinds of good to know what the difference is. You need to see different styles, different experiments, different ways of unfolding narratives. And a lot of that, I think, stayed with me because of that indiscriminate reading. But I read, I read all the sort of serious literature available to me in the English language. Between about 11, 12 and about 19, I must have read 500 greatest books of world literature in translation. There was one crazy year, the year between 12 and 13, I think it was, when I actually set myself the ridiculous target of reading 365 books in the year, and I actually finished my target by Christmas. I then decided not to do that again because it was a terrible, terrible way. I mean, obviously, you were so anxious to finish that you couldn't savor the pleasure of the writing. And so I vowed never to do that again. But the point is that I read. And so as a result, I developed a fairly wide-ranging familiarity with various kinds of writing, various genres, and I realized what I liked and what I enjoyed reading and what I enjoyed writing. And so I think in many ways my reading is what made me a writer. But I read for escape, I read for entertainment, I read for education, I read to widen my horizons, I read for the opportunity to enter the worldview and the experiences of strangers whom I might never meet, and whose worlds and whose experiences were far removed from my own. So all of those things came into why I read. And as a result, I think the sensibility I have today, if it's cosmopolitan or internationalist or global in many ways, it is not merely because I spent a lifetime adult career at the United Nations. It was shaped by my global cosmopolitan reading even before I left the shores of India to go to graduate school.
Do you know Indian writers who are shaped by reading your books? And how do they like, how do you like their readings?
Indian readers have been very kind in telling me all that. No Indian writer of any consequence has said it to me. If somebody one day tells me, I will remember it to answer questions like this in the future, Andrey. But the truth is that, my writing too is a bit difficult to classify. If you look at my 18 books, they're almost, there is 3-hour trilogy about India, but the rest are difficult to pigeonhole in relation to each other. There are 4 fiction works, 3 novels, and a collection of short stories. But even amongst the novels, 2 are satires, 1 is not. The short stories are various genres, part of my experimenting with the craft of writing in my late teens and early 20s. So the stories in the short story collection were all written between about 16 and 21. And still a publisher found them good enough to bring out within the covers of a book. And as I saw when I signed today, they're still being read. So that's good to know. And I'm no longer anywhere close to 16 to 21. So that was interesting. And then the other thing is that the nonfiction has ranged from a sort of popular history, this era of darkness we spoke about this morning, to an overtly sort of political book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, my most recent one, to a book that explores the joys of reading and writing, Bookless in Baghdad, which has a lot of essays about my experiences of reading and writing. And finally, I have written even a book about religion, about my religion and what it means to me.
I am Hindu.
Why I'm a Hindu.
Yes, I remember from last year.
There you are. So that's the kind of mixture that I've been able to, I hope, bring on to the national conversation. In many ways, it's a part of contributing as a public figure to the discussion of ideas that I believe matter.
Yeah, I'm just thinking now that I'm reading now also much more non-fiction than fiction, and sometimes novels with elements of non-fiction, which give me more information or more insight into stories, real histories, and different.
Did you read Milan Kundera when you were growing up in Ukraine?
He was in Samizdat, yes.
Yeah.
He was. There was an illegal copy of.
And was it
Kundera.
reminiscent of your life in Ukraine? Things like the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, or the unbearable lightness of being.
Not really, because I mean, I think many intellectuals and dissidents in the Soviet Union thought that Milan Kundera had luxury life in Czech Republic because Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia was much better off regarding freedom of expression and access to the foreign cultures than Ukraine. But it was appreciated. I mean, of course,
So was there any writer from another country also under communist rule with whom you identified as a reader?
A writer from other
I mean,
country.
Solzhenitsyn, perhaps?
With Solzhenitsyn, I mean,
Ismail Kadare from Albania?
with Ismail Kadare more than with Solzhenitsyn. With Solzhenitsyn, I had very difficult relationship. I loved his One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. I read Archipelago Gulag when, if police, KGB finds the copy, illegal copy in your house, you go in prison or in camp for 25 years, for 15 years. And we had this copy for several days at home. My brother brought it. So, I mean, I liked it, and it changed my life, because then actually I realized more about history of my family, because my grandfather was Stalinist, and until his death, he never told us, he died in 80, that his two brothers were also leading communists in the north of Russia and were imprisoned in 37, and one spent 25 years in Norilsk, and the other one was sent to Irkutsk area, to Siberia. And then actually, because of Archipelago Gulag, I went into research, and I was traveling by hitchhiking and river hiking in the Soviet Union with dictation machine of huge size, pretending that I'm a student of journalism, looking for important retired people who were occupying important positions in the Stalin's time or Khrushchev's time, and trying to interview them. And only those actually who were upset by Khrushchev, who remained Stalinists, they were ready to talk. Those who had their happy life until very end, they didn't want to tell you the truth. So, I mean, for me, reading Solzhenitsyn learned me that you actually read to find out the truth. And if you don't find a book that tells you the truth, you have to find truth yourself and maybe write it.
So you never read for pure entertainment? You think you disapprove of books that
I think Jack London was read for the entertainment. And then actually I was looking for a very strange thing, and later I found an answer what I was looking for also in the books, not only stories and messages, but the energy coming from the author to the readers. So, I mean, it's very easy to explain. I mean, this American principle of happy end is the simplest example of positive energy passed on together with hope and good ending to the readers, which means that actually readers are getting this energy and using it as batteries to keep their engines and optimism going. And of course, I mean, because I think most of the readers, most of people want confirmation that life is good and it is worth living. And
so well said, because we've had this issue in Kerala, in Malayalam writing, Malayalam cinema. There was a period where every movie used to have a sad ending, and I would hate being dragged off by my mother in Bombay and Calcutta to watch Malayalam movies because they were all tragedies and weepies.
Well,
But that was partially as part of the communist movie. See, they felt that communism was the answer to all the tragedies. So it was made by communist directors and screenwriters to make people feel despair about the system. So it's almost the mirror image of what you're talking about.
Yeah. But also, I just remember that in Europe, even 10 years ago, lots of films were produced, very well made film with bad endings, and the Europeans were saying these are intellectual films. If you want a commercial film will have happy ending, but real intellectual film should have bad ending.
There you are. That's exactly the Indian experience as well. We should soon open it up to the audience, but perhaps I should also ask you, because we've only got you up to your 20s. There's a long way to go in terms of your reading beyond that. And I too have not confessed yet that my favorite writer from my teens onwards is a man called P.G. Wodehouse, who wrote these British comic, very funny, but totally sort of escapist, because it had nothing to do with the real world, either in Britain or in India. But they showed the delights of the language being used as an instrument of pleasure. And that's why I read for that too.
Well,
I should have mentioned.
P.G. Wodehouse was not available, but
and would not translate
my
well.
children love him. Love the books, yes. And,
in translation or in English?
In English, because I mean my kids are trilingual. My wife is English. I'm of Russian origin, but Ukrainian. So we have Ukrainian, Russian, English.
Fantastic.
At home. Yeah.
So the kids read in all three.
Yeah.
But before we get to the kids, you've got to continue your saga. So you read for all those reasons very clear. Next, what happened? Because by 89, the Iron Curtain fell.
I discovered Andrey Platonov. I don't know who. I think probably he was translated into Malayalam, although it is impossible to translate, because he was an incredible guy without proper education, who, after the revolution in Russia of 1917, decided that we should revolutionize Russian language and make it proletariat language, get rid of all the bourgeois grammar structures, words. So, I mean, even vegetables were banned. Some of the vegetables were considered bourgeois vegetables, like artichokes. But I mean, he was playing with the language in such a way that I was just mesmerized reading him, because I was used to the idea that you have only classical academic style, and then you play inside the framework of the rules of the language. And he was breaking those rules, and I understood that, well, if he could, I can break the rules. And I started actually following his example, trying to invent new forms of the existing words, inventing new grammar structures, syntaxes, etc.
Wow.
And it remains in some of my books, but to less extent than in my first novels.
But in Russian or in Ukrainian?
In Russian. I mean, I wrote poetry in Ukrainian and literary jokes in Ukrainian. And I mean, every language dictates its own sort of melody, but not only melody. When I was writing poetry in English, it was very depressive poetry. When I wrote poetry in Russian, it was very optimistic.
Wow.
So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, the English language gave me the idea that actually you cannot write happy things in English.
You should have read Woodhouse instead of leaving it to the kids. So how old were you when 89-90 happened?
Sorry?
How old were you when 89-90
89-90, I was 27, 28, and I was trying to become a writer, but I didn't believe the Soviet Union will collapse. I understood that I will not become a Soviet writer because I don't write Soviet literature, so I was balancing between film script writing and journalism. But at the same time, I mean, the country was disintegrating. The literature which was banned was allowed, and it was the golden time for readers because, I mean, thousands of books were published at that time, in the time of economical crisis.
Glasnost.
And glasnost, yeah. The books were coming to the Soviet readers, which were not published for 50 years, for 60 years, for 70 years. And, I mean, it changed the society, but then this change was neutralized by the collapse of the Soviet Union and disintegration of the social system. So, I mean, the books disappeared from life of majority of people for almost 10 years after 1990-91.
Because so many changes are coming that books also...
Yeah, I mean, people started reading newspapers, and it was booming year for newspapers because everybody wanted to earn money. Everybody wanted to place an advertisement that I'm selling fridge and I want to buy a TV set. And so half of the newspapers were filled with ads, and the other half with crime stories, real crime stories. And these crime stories were much more probably vivid than fictional crime stories.
So did you continue your journalism and write some crime stories too?
I continued writing prose. I mean, sometimes critics say that I write crime stories. I write. I don't know what I write, but I think I write a mixture of realism, post-Soviet realism, which means Soviet surrealism. Because in the it's funny because when my books are published in Germany, and the people say that, oh, you have such an imagination to invent this thing. I said, this thing happened. You didn't notice the other thing which didn't happen, and I invented.
So are you inspired by someone like Mikhail Bulgakov? Or,
yeah, of course, especially since I live practically 10 minutes walk from his home in Kiev.
Wow.
And for me, actually, the reading Master and Margaret was an experience of lifetime because the Master and Margaret was published in a literary magazine Moscow, called Moscow in 1978, in the summer. Me and my brother were in the Crimea taking part in the competition of illegal joke tellers. And the local library received this magazine, and there was immediately a queue. The librarian was given magazine for only one day or one night. And we got it for one night, magazine, and we read the whole novel in turn aloud, me to my brother, and he was to me when I was tired. Fantastic. And until 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, we finished the novel, and we returned, at 10 o'clock, we returned it to the library.
Wow. Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov is one of the great, written in the late 1930s, I think it was. What about 30s?
Yeah, it was written in the 1930s, and it was the first, and actually very important for me, an example of magical realism.
Yeah, that's right. I read it around 1990, I should think, thereabouts. Around the time that the Soviet Union was falling apart. It was fascinating, imagining all that. Well, look, we'll take some questions from the audience. So I think Andrey is full of more stories to tell, so don't hesitate to ask either him or me whatever you'd like to talk about. Sir, to you.
I have two questions. One is for you. Sir, for Shashi Tharoor, sir, I heard your Harvard talk not more than 10 times. I mean, more than 10 times. It is one of the, what is called, 8 minutes which changed the entire world opinion. And my question is...
You mean the Oxford talk?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. The Oxford talks I heard more
else.
than 10 times. And probably one of the best 10 talks ever in the world. And my question to you is that spontaneous exuberance, where it is coming from? It is not that your, what is called, wide reading. Maybe something more than that. I'd like to hear from you that. Second question.
And then okay, I'll answer that. I mean, the simple answer is that the reading gives you the ideas, but to express them, you need practice. And it's true that my father, fortunately, was deeply convinced from a very young age of the importance of public speaking, partially because he considered he was not good at it. So I was enrolled in what used to be called elocution classes in my school from third standard onwards. Then when they offered debates, my father insisted I volunteer for debates. In the first few speeches, he helped me write the speech, made me memorize it and speak. So the confidence of delivery came from seeing how you could have an impact on an audience.
It's not complete, sir. It is intelligence plus wide reading. It's extraordinary IQ plus wide reading.
So the substance came that way, but the fluency, if you like, came from repeated childhood practice in speech and debate competitions.
Please give me more details about Holodomor, and still there are communists in Ukraine.
Well,
even after Holodomor, is there communists in Ukraine now?
Holodomor, actually, Shashi Tharoor talked today about the artificial famines in India, practically organized by Brits. In Ukraine, there were 2 artificial famines. They were administrated by Ukrainian and Russian communists, and it was 1932-33. When, because of the practical agricultural disaster, 6 or 7 million people died, and the peasants who were trying to find refuge in the cities were not allowed in. So the army surrounded big cities, not allowing people looking for food to enter the cities. Second famine was after the war in 1946-47. It was a smaller famine, but it was also because all the food was taken to the other regions, because there were famines at the same time in other regions of the Soviet Union. Ukraine was always considered the agricultural, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union and before of Tsarist Russia. So the Ukrainian leaders were always told to send all their wheat, all the food supplies to other regions. The Communist Party in Ukraine was banned about 10 years ago, but it was not an independent Communist Party. They were acting as actually agents of Russian Communist Party. And we have now Socialist Party, which is active in their place. Sorry?
Is it communist in nature?
No, Socialist Party is not communist in nature. So they don't want to take everything from private owners and to give it to workers and peasants.
We have two communist parties here that are not communist in
nature. But I should say that the leader of the Communist Party of Ukraine, who is still around and traveling the world, I mean, he is a very rich man. So, I mean, the Ukrainian communists, at least the tops of them, until they were banned, they were driving the most expensive Mercedeses. They were sponsored by oligarchs who actually were interested to have them as their hand in the parliament. But they couldn't enter the last parliament when they were still allowed to enter the parliament.
Actually, the Mercedes driving communist in India, I think the equivalent in the 60s and 70s was the Fiat car communist. We had quite a few of those.
But maybe this is a real communism when everyone drives a Mercedes.
Questions? Yes, well.
Hi.
The mic, okay. Sorry, go ahead, ma'am.
Hi, I was really, can you hear me?
A little closer to you, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I was really interested to hear the books that impacted you. I noticed many were written by men, and the ones written by women had male heroes in it. Were there any books that helped introduce you to the idea that as men you had a privileged position in society and introduced you to questions of gender difference?
Well, I think the first lady writer I read, and it was also in the Soviet times, it was Françoise Sagan, the French writer. I mean, these were romantic stories with some kind of social background, yeah.
She was not spectacularly feminist.
No, she was not, no.
I think the questioner is curious as to whether through books you became aware of the problems of patriarchy and gender inequality in society and so on.
I don't remember. I mean, either I'm old or I wasn't aware of.
Did you read Simone de Beauvoir?
No.
Ah. And Germaine Greer later?
Also
female
not yet.
Okay,
not yet.
So he has yet to discover feminist literature. We'll need to send them to him through his wife. Anyone else? Yeah, here's a... sorry.
Hi, sir. The question is for Dr. Tharoor. I very well know this is a session for reading, but I would like to ask about your writing. You're not just a writer. Now you're a very explicit politician, and you're everywhere in the constituency. You're traveling places for speeches. You seem to be a very busy man, and out of nowhere, one fine morning, you come out with a fat book that is called the Paradoxical Prime Minister. I would love to know, I was very curious, how do you fetch the time to write, and what is your process of writing?
So you only need to find time when you've lost it in the first place. So if you make every effort not to lose the time that God has given you, that's one thing. I'm afraid in my case that means at the expense of sleep to a great extent. I'm actually not an insomniac. I enjoy getting some sleep, but I recognize that with the public life I lead, it is very often 11 p.m. before I'm left alone. And the only window I would have would be between 11 at night and 2 in the morning. I used to be an early morning person. As a student, I would actually go to sleep at 8, 8:30, wake up at 4:30 or 5 and study for my exams. And that's how I had the uninterrupted quiet. But for a politician, there is certainly no quiet after 7 a.m. So it is better to work at night. And, the truth is that the fat books are partially because I don't have the time to make them shorter. Concise writing requires real effort and discipline in trimming down, whereas I sort of write practically in a gush. And then don't have the time to shorten it. So it's often true that I am saying in 400 words what could have been said in 200. But I get to those 400 words because, and I'm borrowing from another writer here, the American humorist A.J. Liebling, he said, and I quote because it applies to me, I write faster than anybody who writes better, and I write better than anybody who writes faster. Sir.
So, my question is to you.
Andrey Kurkov, yeah.
As a person who has lived in the Soviet Union, you are familiar with the censorship of literature. What is your opinion about it? Is it essential? I do not mean total censorship. That's before anything is published, any article or story, any piece of literary work. Before it is published, it should be censored. It should be examined by some government agency or like that. But in exceptional cases, that people say that it is necessary. What do you say?
Well, you know, in the Soviet time, every article was censored. Everywhere there was a censor. And I knew the main censor of Ukraine, for example. It was very interesting to talk to him because he was not very literate. But he knew what was not allowed to be printed. He was responsible also for publishing houses. We have now in Ukraine situation when people demand censorship, not the institutions. It's very crazy. I mean, there are some very rough reactions from radicals to the texts or to the exhibitions. And some pogroms made by groups of citizens, not by institutions. So Ukraine doesn't have censorship now, and I think this is the ideal situation. The censorship can be introduced during the war and during the different social problems, because I mean then you have to direct the feelings of people, not to get them too emotional. But otherwise, I'm against censorship. And I should tell you that when Nikita Khrushchev wanted to publish Solzhenitsyn's novel One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which was written in '59, he couldn't do it for 2 years without consent of all the members of Politburo and without special decree of Central Committee of Communist Party, decree number 10. So even the head of the country had to go through the censorship trying to publish what he wanted to publish.
Censorship should not be there.
I mean this for the exception, except for the texts which inspire violence or produce and promote fascist and other ideas which lead to more violence or to segregation. But this, I mean, for example, I mean, this thing is written in criminal code in Ukraine, not in the act about censorship. So, I mean, anyway, if you instigate violence, whether by books or by public speeches or by other, it is a criminal offense. It is not matter for the literary specialists.
So you mean to say that the police is the deciding authority? Police will decide whether this is
It's not a police because I mean there is a special institution in Ukraine where you can complain if you think that actually somebody is instigating racist or other feelings. Sorry?
So I think you've made your point and he's answered them. So let's move on to others. The short answer, he's asking, should there not be a government agency that will decide this?
Well, there is
you are actually reflecting the position in India as well. In theory, anyway, you are free to write anything you like, but the moment you actually write something that incites religious disturbance or communal violence or hurts the sentiments of community, somebody will come down on you like a ton of bricks. They'll take you to court. Yeah. The judges will end up deciding. In the meantime, your books will not be available for sale. So there are de facto, as it were, the society creates these pressures and reflects them through the legal and criminal system.
But we are entering the era when more and more countries will introduce censorship for Facebook or punishment for posts in Facebook. I mean, in Russia there are 3,000 cases and 600 people were put in the prison for the posts which were not really anti-racial or something, which were probably anti-government.
Right, sorry, there was another hand on this side.
Good morning, sir. I want to know both of your opinions on this question. I've been reading Indian history and the world history for the last 2 years, and what I've noticed is that most Indians and most Malayalis, we are familiar with what happened in India, and we are familiar with what happened in Germany, and we get books on books written by Hitler, even books written by Hitler in Malayalam. But I find it really curious that we don't have any literature about Holodomor or Gulag in our textbooks or be it in Malayalam. What is your opinion on that? And secondly, do you feel that the literature on Gulag and Holodomor is essential reading?
You see, the textbooks, of course, are limited by the size of the textbook, the syllabus, and so on. And because I don't think we actually offer world history at any school across India, it's not surprising, if you like, that it was omitted. Plus, while the present lot are ruling ideologically, they would probably still be uncomfortable exposing the underbelly of the Soviet experience. But at least we are a free society, and anybody with the curiosity can go and find material about it and read about it. And if you can't find a book on it, you can go on Wikipedia. I'm sorry. I mean, I don't mean to be dismissive, but my point is, we should never feel, no student should feel confined to know only what's in the textbook. I would never have developed my obsession with history if I confined myself to the history textbooks of school. It's because I read beyond the textbooks that I found the subject so fascinating. And I would, I perhaps didn't say it when Andrey asked the question, I read a lot of history, even though I read indiscriminately every genre. I read the things I enjoyed more were things like history. In fiction, I always read comic fiction. I didn't want to read to be depressed, except to get a, so you read someone like Theodore Dreiser or Sinclair Lewis in America to understand a particular historical period, but you didn't dwell on, you didn't read book after book showing, depressed coal miners or workers in the factories. You got the idea, got the message, there was a problem, enough. I don't want to spend 4 hours wallowing in that experience. I'd rather read, 2 Woodhouses in that time. And that kind of, I'm being flippant, but you see my point. However, history I read because the subject interested me. And I would urge all of you here who feel frustrated by what's missing from your history textbooks to go out and read beyond the textbook and find things. Everything is available in our country. You can read about it. But Andrey, it's interesting to get a young Keralite asking you about your Holocaust.
No, that's very interesting. I think actually the information about main national tragedies all around the world should be known to all politicians around the world, so their activities would not lead to repetition of such tragedies. Because, if you don't know the history, history repeats itself. So, first of all, it is important for people who are civil servants and for the politicians and for everybody else who wants to know. He should have access. Also, I've heard first time about massacre of Jalalabad, today. And
Jallianwala Bagh.
Jallianwala Bagh.
Bagh means garden.
Yeah. I thought I know so much about English history, and this is part of English history, British history, and one can say British shame. But I know a lot about Soviet shame, about Soviet history. Of course, this is my main basis of knowledge. Yeah. But of course, if you want to know this, the information, the books should be available for you.
Yes, there was one more hand here.
Hi. While this session is on why I read, as writers, Charles Bukowski tend to say that if it doesn't come naturally to you, or it doesn't come bursting out of you, or if it doesn't come unasked from your heart or mind, you shouldn't write. In a sense, if you stare at a computer screen for long, you shouldn't be writing. So, what is your perspective, both of yours, on being a writer? And do you guys agree with Bukowski, for instance, it should come naturally to you?
Well, I agree, actually, because I write because I have something to say. There are people who write because they feel they have to say something. That's different. But I have a message I want to communicate when I'm writing nonfiction. And even in my fiction, it's somewhat didactic, because I'm trying to tell a story that provokes reflections on certain aspects of life in India. So, yeah, I'm very, very sort of motivated by my urgent concerns as an Indian who cares about everything that's made India and nearly unmade it, in fact threatens still to unmake it. And I want to use my writing as a means of expressing that.
But if it doesn't come prolific to you, while you want to write on the subject...
Well, I've always found writers block a peculiar problem. You don't tell a carpenter or a plumber, it's okay, today you don't feel like doing it, the inspiration is not coming to you. Why are writers given the luxury of sitting at a screen and staring at it for 6 hours? They should write. That's why if they're writers, they should write. If it's not good enough, they should rewrite, they should cut, they should edit, they can even discard. But they should write. The point is that this business of, if you call yourself a writer, it's because you are motivated to write. It is your natural form of expressing the things you care about. So write what you care about. I mean, I don't know the particular quote you cited from Charles Bukowski, but it makes perfect sense. You write because you want to say something. It's in you. It's urgently trying to come out. And all you need is the time and the tools to put it down for others to know what you want them to know.
That's what your take as well?
Well, it's similar with me. I mean, I have more ideas than time. I have to react to what is happening in my country. Naturally, I react. I don't force myself to react because I'm a very peaceful person who can get angry very easily.
And that anger comes out in the words.
Yeah, and then I have to put my novel aside and write 2 or 3 columns or an article. Then I'm asked for last 2 weeks by Norwegian Weekly to explain to Norwegian readers what is happening in Ukraine. I feel it is my duty to explain because they don't know other writer from Ukraine. And I'm not taking sides. I'm not part of political structure in Ukraine because I can easily criticize both sides, and I'm hated by both sides.
I used to be like that. Yeah. 2 last questions because the organizers feel we have to wrap up in 3 minutes. So please be brief, sir. You and then you. And then we have to, I'm really sorry.
Sir, 2 questions, one to Andrey and one to Shashiji. To Andrey, I'm asking, you said, you enjoy reading happy end books, because that it would instill in you a feeling of well-being and bonhomie. Okay, but then, reading sad ending books would inspire you to do something more to the society, that would ameliorate the kind of sufferings and other things of our society.
If you read books that had happy endings in order to make you feel positive and optimistic, shouldn't you read books with sad endings to make you motivated to transform society, to bring about change?
Well, I read books with unhappy endings according to our school program. I mean, all the books in the school program in the Soviet time were the books with unhappy ending, showing the life in horrible conditions of life in Tsarist Russia, telling us about problems, racial problems in America, the Angel, Tom's Hut, etc. So, I mean, now there are books which I like, which are heavy and which describe real problems. It doesn't mean that I don't read them. The main thing is that I should get engaged in the reading from the first page. But I mean, I will jump to the question about writer's block. I mean, if you have a writer's block, take a bad book and force yourself to read it. And then you will go back to writing very easily. Yeah.
You said, during 60s and 70s, Malayalam movies had a desperate sort of, because the directors are mostly following communist ideologies, thinking that there will be a solution to all the miseries in their way of thinking. And these days, most of our movies are twisted, the storyline is twisted to bring about a happy ending. So you think the directors follow the Congress ideology, who think the solution to the problems are just laughing it off?
Well, I mean, my problem with the sad endings, it was always unrelenting despair, and the political agenda became particularly explicit in films like Ningal Enne Communist Aki. So the title is You Made Me a Communist. So they show the horrors and miseries inflicted by the bourgeois system and said that you want to be and the film ends with all these red flags waving and they're about to take over the world. I mean, obviously those kinds of things left me hostile, I'm afraid, to that ideology. But today a lot more cinema is about entertainment and escape, perhaps partially because people have developed a sense that society is more or less where they want it to be and that change can be brought about in different ways. And there are other kinds of change these cinemas reflect. Many more films, for example, showing freedom and autonomy of women than used to be. Now it's no longer class struggle so much, but there are gender issues coming up. There are some caste issues coming up in films. And there are issues of social transformation and change that move away from simple class ideology. I'm going to be trying to be brief because I'm getting signals from the organizers. This young man has the last question.
I would like to thank you for the opportunity for asking you a question. I have written more than 100 poems in a month of 7 to 8 months. But
Great.
Every time I have written this, I have felt incomplete about some of my works. So my question to both of you is, have you ever felt being incomplete about the work that you have written?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think, Andrey, have you ever felt incomplete? When you've done some work, have you felt it wasn't quite there?
Yeah, I had several cases like this, and I had 3 novels that I rewrote 2 or 3 years after publication of the book. and now they are available in the new version. So I mean, I was unhappy for 3 or 2 years, trying to understand what was making me unhappy in the book that I wrote. And then once I rewrote it, it was finished.
So I've never done that, but that's partly because I don't have enough time for the rewriting or even rereading much. But I'll tell you, when I'm in the process of writing, I'm always reviewing. In other words, I will go back to what I wrote yesterday when I'm writing today, and I may change a lot of things. And that's a process that goes on, because my life means a lot of my writing is interrupted. So sometimes I'm picking up the threads weeks after I left where it was, and I have to reread what I've written to see if it persuades me, the reader, before I continue to resume it as a writer. So in the process of creation, yes, I'm constantly redoing it. Indeed, the first draft of An Era of Darkness was half what the final book was, because I felt I needed to do much more and substantiate more points, but that first half gave me a structure for the argument, and then I did that. But once a book is published, I would never go back and redo it, even if I can see flaws, because nothing is perfect. Because I feel it's rather like producing a child. The child may not be perfect, but once a child is out there, you have to let her stand on her own 2 feet and go out into the world. And thereafter, people may judge and say, this is a bad person, or this is a person with these flaws. But the fact is, that's how creation works. Until these Chinese doctors started doing gene editing, creation produces flawed human beings, and writers can produce flawed books, and critics and readers will tell them so. But it's only by producing those flawed books, being judged by readers and writers, that you realize you can do better next time, and that's how you go on. So to my mind, once the book is out there, I wouldn't redo it, but I commend Andrey's bravery and courage and self-criticism that he felt able to do that. I'm sure one day, those first early editions of the later novels will actually be more worthwhile to a collector, a scholar, a student of Ukrainian literature than the perfected work. Because through the flaws and the corrections, people will get into the mind of Andrey Kurkov, the writer. Thank you all very much. It's been a fabulous session. Thank you, Andrey.
Thank you.
If you want to know about Andrey's writing, you have one more session, right?
I have, I think, 3 more.
3 more
or
sessions.
4 more sessions, but yep.
So, are your books in English?
Yeah, there are lots of them. Maybe 12, more in German and French, but in English 12, I think. Yeah.
And as for me, I'm off tomorrow to be in Parliament for the budget, but I will be back on Saturday and have a couple of sessions then. See you all. Thanks very much. Have a great opening day of the Mathrubhumi International Book Festival.
Enjoy the festival.